Alright, so we're going to look at Beef 101, and we are focusing this unit on meats, particularly proteins, how to cook them, how to buy them, etc. So we're going to look at beef right now. Now, meat in general, that includes poultry, which is chicken or turkey, fish, eggs, dried beans, and nuts, are your major sources of protein in your diet. Now, even if you're a vegetarian, you still need protein in your diet, and you have to be a little creative to get there. In addition to proteins being nutritious, protein is often the main part of a meal. When you go out to eat, you're going to get a steak with some sides, or a chicken breast with some sides. Your protein is usually the star of your meal. Now, with that said, proteins are more likely the most expensive part of your meal or your food budget. So when you go shopping for protein, you need to be able to purchase carefully, know exactly what you're putting your money into, so that when you get home, you can get the most out of your product with the least amount of money spent. The lab that's doing steak, we are spending a little bit more money, and we are going with I guess you would say a not cheap cut of meat, because we're going to pan fry it, and we're not going to cook it slow, in a stew or anything like that, so it can tenderize on, and break down on its own. We are going to put it in a pan, we're going to sear it, we're going to cook it to temperature, and we're going to enjoy it. So you want your meat to be a little bit on the fattier side, and you want your meat to be a little bit more expensive cut, because that will yield a more tender piece than if you get a leaner, cheaper cut. So we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So buying protein, you need to know how to evaluate protein, and to evaluate the quality of proteins based on how it looks and other factors and how it's labeled. So, looking at meat in general, meat is the edible portion of animals. This includes the muscles and the organs. The most common forms of meat are beef, which comes from mature cattle, veal, which come from young cattle, pork, which comes from pigs or swine, lamb, which comes from young sheep. So when you are purchasing meat, you need to consider these two factors: the quality of the meat and the cut of the meat. So in the United States, all meat that's shipped across state lines have to be inspected. This is done by the USDA, and it certifies that the meat is wholesome and indicates that the plant that it's processed from is sanitary. In addition to an inspection stamp, beef, veal, lamb may be stamped with a grade shield. Now, the mandatory meat inspection, or beef inspection, that's sold at all at retail and food service level, the USDA carries out the inspection, and it will be stamped with one of these. This tells the buyer that the meat is from a reputable source, it is from sanitary conditions, and the meat itself is from animals that were healthy. So now that we have, now that we have inspection, we're going to look at grades. Now, inspections are not mandatory, they're not voluntary, they are mandatory. However, grading is voluntary, and it's usually paid for by the processor or the packer. And it gives an estimate of your palatability, whether the tenderness, the juiciness, and the flavors of the cooked lean meat. So there are three categories that we're going to look at. We have the USDA Prime, the USDA Choice, and USDA Select. These grades are going to help consumers determine the tenderness and the juiciness and the quality of the meats. So looking at Prime, Prime is going to have the best quality and flavor. It is going to be the most tender because it has the most marbling. And marbling is that fat that's interweaved through the meat that mingle through the lean. That marbling, as it cooks, it melts and it causes your meat to be tender and it causes it to be juicy. Now, you can go to the grocery store and you can probably find prime, but it is not highly sought out in just a regular Walmart. You can go to a butcher and you probably can get it, but prime is mainly sold at restaurants and high-end steakhouses. Prime is very expensive. So the everyday cook, cooking for their family, may not necessarily need that best quality. So the next one comes with choice cut. Now your choice grade has excellent quality. It's going to have less fat and less flavor than your prime, but it's also going to be less expensive. It's the middle of the pack, so it's less expensive than your prime, but it's going to be a little bit more expensive than your select cut. Now your select cut is going to have less flavor and less marbling than both the prime and the choice. It's going to have less fat, and it's also going to have lower costs. So when you are looking for a healthy or a budget angle, the select is probably the best bet for you. So when I'm talking about marbling, you can kind of see here what I mean. So the 3 on the top, they are marbled and they go slowly down to the level of marbling. So if I was to judge them, I would say the first 2 cuts, these would be falling in your prime. This one here may fall in these 2 will fall in your choice, and these 2 would be in your select. And you can see the difference in that whiteness in between the meat. That is where the flavor is going to come from. That is where the tenderness and the juiciness is going to come from. That's that fat that's woven into these into the meat. Alright, so now that you've gone to the grocery store, you're looking at the different inspected meats, now you see their grades. What exactly are you looking for? Because even if it's a prime cut of beef, if it's been sitting out, if it's been time temperature abused, or if it's past its sell-by date, it's not going to be a good piece of meat. So you can make sure that the quality is good if it has good color and is marbled with fat. When you're looking for beef, your beef should be bright red. Now, if your beef has almost a shiny green color on the edges, it means that the beef has been exposed to a light for long periods of time, and I would probably stay away from that one. But you want your beef to be bright red. Your veal is going to be a light pink color. Your pork is going to be a pink to almost a rose color, and your lamb is going to be a pink to a reddish color. So when you're grocery shopping, consider who you're cooking for and what your needs are. Buy the cut of meat best suited for your needs by reading your meat labels. By reading the labels, you can identify and find out what type of meat it is, the location of the meat in the animal, and the retail cut of the animal or the retail cut of the meat. If you are looking to make stew, you probably don't need to spend your money on a sirloin or a New York strip or a filet mignon. Those types of meats, they best are for quick cooking, grilling, things like that. When you're stewing, you want a very tougher cut of meat because you want that beef to kind of break down and absorb all those juices and still have some structure by the time you're done with the stewing process. So kind of have an idea what you're going to need this meat for so that you know what kind of meat to purchase. So grocery shopping, when you are looking at tenderest cuts of meat, these are going to come from a very small portion of the animal. These are going to come from the parts of the animal that does very little work. And I will show you that in a second. They are going to be the loin cuts, things like that, your fillet, your strips, those that runs along the back, that has no muscle movement, those are going to be your tender cuts of meat because they're going to be heavily fatty. They are also going to be the most expensive, and they're also going to be most sought out by customers. So when checking the doneness, the best way to judge your doneness of the meat is to use a thermometer. Make sure that it's calibrated, and stick it in through the middle, the side of the thickest portion of the steak or the meat. And you want to make sure that you wait till it stops moving to register your temperature. Alright, so looking at our carcass divisions, the part that I was telling you about that's going to be the tenderest are going to come from here. This is the area that the animal does very little work. This here, nowadays, because of fajitas, these have become pretty popular as well. They do require a little bit of cooking, lower and slower cooking marinades, like fajitas and things like that. But right here, this is where you're going to find your strip, your sirloin, your filet mignon. Now here, these areas, they do a lot of work. They move the cow around. So they are going to be kind of tough because they're going to be very lean. Alright, so you might have gone to a restaurant and you've heard the term aged beef. Well, what exactly does that mean? The aging process occurs naturally through enzymatic process. The beef, the connective tissue in the meat is broken down, and the maximum tenderization occurs after it's been aged in the refrigerator for 10 to 12 days. Now, aging can be done either wet or dry, and what the ideal product comes out is a more tender, more flavored piece of meat. So if you go to a fancy steakhouse and they are offering aged beef, find out how long they're aging it, and then that can help determine if that piece of meat is worth your extra, $30 that you're going to spend for that same steak that you can get at a not so fancy steakhouse that isn't aged. Alright, so beef cookery. Cuts from the ribs or loins are going to be more tender. They require high dry heat and they cook very quickly. Cuts from the chuck and the rounds are going to be less tender because remember they're going to be doing a lot more work moving that animal around. So they need to be cooked with lower moist heat and they need to cook longer. You're usually going to cook either to medium rare doneness for round cuts or to well done stage for the chuck cuts. And tenderizing marinade is often recommended for these types of meats. Now, when you're cooking roasts and steaks, they should be cooked to a minimum of 145 degrees. You should be able to use a thermometer to check the doneness. You can visually check, but really, unless you know what you're looking for, it's very difficult to feel check or visual check. Best way, stick a thermometer in it, check the temperature. Now, ground beef must be cooked to 160 degrees because ground beef is the product of one or two things. It could come from the same animal, but the tissue has been ground up and all the parts on the outside of the animal or the outside of the meat is now pushed all throughout the meat. So any of the bacteria that was originally on the outside is now throughout the entire stack of ground beef. Steaks, on the other hand, if you cook the steaks on the outside and it's grilled and it's charred and it kills all the bacteria, the inside of your steak is not going to have any bacteria in it. Alright, so marinades, or if you're British, you call them marinades. They contain a weak acid and they're used to tenderize meat by breaking down the muscle fiber. So some of the acids could include lemon juice, tomatoes, wine, vinegar, or yogurt. Now keep in mind that marinades only penetrate about a 1/4 inch into the meat. So if you do want to make sure that you get more marinades in, you want to kind of tenderize it, poke some holes in it, that will help get it in there. But your entire cut of meat, if you have a giant roast and you put it in a bag of marinade, it's not going to taste like it all the way through. The outside will, but the inside, it won't penetrate that much. So Marinades are less useful for larger cuts of meats and roasts unless you're using it for the flavor of the outside, that crust that develops. You always want to marinate in the refrigerator. Don't ever leave your marinade and your meat sitting out on the counter. And you don't want to marinate in the freezer because really everything stops working. Your marinade freezes, your meat freezes, and nothing's working. Nothing's getting in there. To marinate, you'll put it in a plastic bag or in a utility dish. Or you could even vacuum seal it. That will help speed up the marination process, actually. But you don't ever want to use a metal container because some marinades are acidic and they can cause a reaction with the metal. So how much marinade should you use? You should use about 1/4 to 1/2 cup of marinade for each 1 to 2 pounds of beef. Alright, so now that you've gotten your beef from the grocery store, you picked out what you wanted, how long can it sit in your refrigerator and stay good? Now, if you are getting steaks and roasts, they are good in the refrigerator for about 3 to 4 days before they start to have an off flavor. If you're not going to use them within those 3 to 4 days, the best thing to do is to put those steaks and roasts in the freezer, and they last about 6 to 12 months in the freezer. Ground beef, especially if it's nicely freshly ground, they could go about 1 to 2 days. If they are hermetically sealed, if they're like in those little tubes, they can go a little bit longer. Just check the date on the outside to see, when they were packed, what's the best by date or what's the best cook by date. If you're not going to use your ground beef within those 1 to 2 days, you probably want to put them in the freezer, and they last in the freezer for about 3 to 4 months. And if you are going to put them in the freezer, make sure you put the date on them so that you know when you put them in there, and you'll know what's in it and how long it should stay in the freezer. If you have any leftovers, say you had a roast, you made a Yankee pot roast and you have some leftover, that roast will stay good in your refrigerator for about 3 to 4 days. And it can even freeze. I would suggest cutting it into smaller pieces or more manageable pieces so that when you're ready to eat it again, you don't have to thaw the entire roast. You can just thaw, 1/4 of it at a time. Alright, so beef, nutritional aspects of beef. Beef is a source of protein. Our body needs protein. So one of the nutrients that we need in order to be healthy and our body to work well. Protein helps repair your body if you were having any muscle tears or things like that. So protein is really important in our diet. We look back and the beef nowadays is actually more healthier than it was 60, 70, 80 years ago. Those long time ago, beef, the cows or the cattle were just fed slop, or they weren't fed nutritious meal regimens to keep them leaner. So, and also resulting from genetic changing, our beef today is a lot more leaner than it was back then. So if you want to look at beef, you want to compare it to something that we think of as healthier. We have skinless chicken breasts. We can look at the breakdown right here. So you can see chicken and a sirloin tip side steak, not much difference in terms of saturated fat and total fat between skinless chicken breast and a steak. It's really about eating in moderation. Yes, your chicken breast may be the size of a deck of cards. Your steak should be as well. You should not eat a 30-pound or 30-ounce steak because you can. That's where you start to get unhealthy. Alright, so majority of beef found in grocery store are going to be from cattle raised in pastures. That's most of their lives. And then they're finished on a grain diet for the last 120 to 200 days of their life. Alright, natural beef. These are going to be the beef that's found that is natural. It has not a lot of processing. It has no additives, no colors, or preservatives. It applies to all meat with no ingredient label. And it's used as a natural for some marketing purposes. organic certified beef. In order for a beef to be classified as organic, it must meet USDA National Organic Certification Standards. That means the cattle must be fed 100% organic feed. There should be no hormones to promote growth or antibiotics for any reasons. The cattle must have access to pasture. And the cattle must be certified through the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service. Then we have grass-finished beef. This comes from cows that have grazed in pastures their entire lives. Tends to grade select because they're not as fatty. They're a little bit more leaner. So you'll have minimal marbling. They're going to be less tender than grain-finished beef, again, because less fat. And flavor panels, so consumers prefer the overall flavor of grain-finished of grass finish over grain finish. Alright, so we're going to look at branded beef. Some of you may have heard of the term Kobe beef or Wagyu beef. These are breed specific. These are from cattle that are specifically bred. Kobe beef from Wagyu cattle are raised in Japan. They're fed beer, they're massaged, and they're brushed with sake. Supposedly, they're supposed to be some of the best pieces of meat you could ever have. I personally have never gotten to have Kobe beef or real Kobe beef because I have never been to Japan, but I would really like to try it one day. Now, the company specific, these are going to be in terms of grade, marbling, size, type of feed, and restrictions on antibiotics and hormones. I'm going to use Tyson's chicken as an example. So this will be a company specific. You know, Tyson's talk about how their animals are natural, there are no antibodies and things like that. So that would be the company specific type meat label. And then we have store branded. These are going to be branded by grocery stores. So for instance, Walmart has its line, Hy-Vee has its line. Alright, so now you guys are going to enroll yourself in Beef U. And what I'm going to have you do is you're going to click on the link within that page on Schoology. And it's going to take you to beefu.org. You are going to need to first sign up here. So click on the sign up here button. You are going to develop your username. Make sure that it's something that you will not forget. Does not necessarily need to be your email, but it could be. Now you're going to add your email, and then you're going to select a password. Make sure you remember your password. So write down your username, write down your password on your notes that you just got. You're going to confirm your password, and then you're going to give yourself your details. So put your name, first name, last name, gender, organization, and then you're going to put me as your supervisor email. So make sure you have lakisha.jordan@k12.sd.us. Then you'll just put the school information here. The only things that you have to have are the things with asterisks, so you can just fill in those. You don't have to have the phone number or anything like that. Here, code. We didn't have a custom code, so we're going to put in new user. Just type in new user there. And then you'll just do your security check. Whatever's in there, just type it in the box. Oops. And then click register. Alright, so once you've registered, you are going to have the module page pop up like this. And the ones that you're going to do all of them. You're going to start with basic cuts and basic beef. So you'll click this one, click start, and you're going to go through. Now, each unit of the module is about 15 minutes long, so pace yourself. So you're going to read through your description, and then you're going to start the lesson. So you click on the lesson and get started.
Welcome to this Beef U module on beef basics and cuts, created specifically for grocery, retail, and food service operators.
So once you finish your module, you're going to click the quiz and take the 15 question quiz. When you're finished with your quiz, you want to click View Results and then Finish. So when you're ready, you can go back to the program homepage, and then you can do your next one.